Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to continue my landscape in colored pencil series, and in this video I'm going to show you how to draw grass and dirt. I'm going to use the same materials that I did in previous videos, Fabriano Polychromos pencils on a toned paper primed with clear gesso. I always recommend with colored pencils that you should use a sanded surface. But here in this video it may be even more important than in some of the previous ones, because here I intend to work a little bit more from dark to light than I usually do. So I'm going to show you how it was done. Let's get to it. I'm going to start with something simple. I'm going to draw a single tuft of grass just to show you my basic approach. And I'm going to use several greens. I'm going to start with this middle green for a mid-tone, and then I'm going to use some darker and lighter greens on top of that. I just picked up some greens that I had at hand, but you can choose any colors you like. My approach is mostly based on value, but I think this will work. So let's see. So I'm drawing these blades of grass, varying my angle and direction a little bit, but basically I'm pulling one directional tapered strokes and just making them fan out and overlap a little bit, because that's sort of the way grass grows. You want to make it a little bit random. So on top of that I'm using a darker green. This is chrome oxide green or something. So a darker green for the darker values, because there will be some blades of grass in there that will be a little bit darker because they're facing away from the light source, or maybe they're in the shadow, it doesn't really matter. So just to give it a little bit more depth and structure. And as you can see, this is already starting to look a little bit more like grass. And once I have enough of those, I'm going to add even darker values, especially here at the bottom, using a black colored pencil. Because here at the bottom of the tuft, I'm expecting there to be a bit more shadow, because the light is usually coming from above. So the tuft is also going to be casting a bit of shadow onto the ground below, so a bit more shadow at the bottom. After that, I'm using a sharp lighter green pencil to pull these final strokes where I'm pulling these lighter blades of grass, to indicate that these are some of those blades of grass which are sticking out and catching light from above. You can see that these lighter marks are in fact showing up a little bit against the darker background. That's because of the textured surface I'm using. On a regular paper, this wouldn't really be possible. So this is the first tuft of grass, and I think it turned out okay. Now we're going to try something a little bit larger and a little bit more complex. So I'm going to try to draw a slightly larger patch of grass. And for this, maybe I'm going to use slightly different colors, and I'm going to start with some darker tones and then work with lighter tones on top of that. So let's see how it goes. So first I'm going to draw some of these vertical marks, again varying a little bit, varying the direction a little bit, just so that it doesn't look too uniform. And I'm mostly I'm mostly drawing this around the edges, because I'm going to be blending over it anyway, so I'm not particularly concerned about the exact appearance and the texture and things like that, because I'm going to be adding layers on top of that, and I'm going to be doing a bit of blending maybe, but mostly just adding layers on top. So once I have this first layer here, I'm just going to soften it a little bit with a tortillon, just to spread it through these lighter areas of the paper which I haven't covered properly. And then I'm going to add a few more darker marks, but this time I'm going to use a black colored pencil to indicate these shadow areas in between the tufts of grass and at the bottom of them, and also in between the blades of grass which are sticking out and which are catching light from the light source. So I want to have some of these smaller shadow areas in this patch of grass. So now it looks like dark grass, but now I'm going to add some lighter marks on top of that. First I'm going to use this yellowish green, which is not much lighter than the colors that I put down first, but I just want to have that in there just so that I could have more depth and so that I could modify the color a little bit. And on top of that I'm going to use another lighter green, just like I did with the first drawing. So when I'm pulling these strokes, the pencil needs to be pretty sharp, otherwise this won't really work very well, and you want to twist your pencil a little bit as you pull those strokes, because the tooth of this clear gesso, this surface covered with clear gesso, the tooth gets saturated relatively quickly, so you want to keep that tip clean and you want to twist it a little bit. You want to keep it sharp as well, so that you can get these cleaner marks with a clean edge to value, so that they would look like actual blades of grass. And you want to have enough of them, you want to have enough density so that it looks like grass. And another thing that you want to do is you want to vary the direction and the shape and the size a little bit. So you want quite a bit of variation in there, because that's the way the grass looks. Sometimes you have some of these shorter, smaller blades of grass, then you have some weeds, then you have these blades of grass leaning this and that way, so you want to have them overlapping so that you can create that feeling of depth and so that it looks more three-dimensional. That's why the range of value is so important. Now for the third drawing, I'm going to try to draw an even larger area covered with grass, almost like a small meadow, because here I want to show you how you can draw grass when you look at grass from a bit further away. Because the first two drawings you got a closer view at the texture and those tufts and the blades of grass, but when we draw landscapes we're usually going to see grass at the distance. So you usually won't be going into such tiny detail. You want to have some of those details, but not quite as much as with the first two drawings. Here, what will be more important, I think, will be trying to convey to the viewer that there is a variation in the shape and the color of the terrain, and just creating the proper texture and colors to make the viewer believe that they are looking at grass, that they are looking at some kind of a grassy field. All right. So I started with a somewhat lighter mid-tone green, and then I added some darker marks. And this is very important. The ones that are closer to our viewpoint are going to be taller and larger. The ones which are further away, which are further back, are going to be smaller and less defined, because they're going to be kind of disappearing in the distance and merging into one another. Now on top of that I'm adding some lighter marks with a lighter green, again sticking to that rule that I have to keep in mind our viewpoint and the distance of the objects from our viewpoint, which means that the blades of grass which are closer to us are going to be a bit more defined, a bit taller and larger, which means that my strokes will have to be a bit longer and larger, and the ones which are further back are going to be smaller and smaller until they become almost like dots, and I can just drag my pencil like this to create a bit of texture that kind of looks like grass as seen from a distance. And another thing that you can see, and this is also very important, is that you want to break this larger surface into smaller segments where you can see tufts of grass sticking out, some of them casting a little bit of shadow onto the ground, others a bit lighter, etc. With this, you want to indicate to the viewer that this terrain is both uneven, but also that the length and the height of that grass varies a little bit. As a final touch, I added a bit of some brownish tones. I added a bit of ochre just to indicate maybe like there are some parts of that ground which aren't completely covered with grass, or maybe there is a little bit of yellowish or dry grass here and there. So you want to have a little bit of variation in color here and there just to make the surface of that area a little bit more interesting. On top of that, as a final touch, I can add some smaller details like flowers. I can use a sharp white pencil to add some flowers here, and again, because of the perspective, the marks which are closer to us are supposed to be larger, so the flowers which are closer to us are supposed to be a bit larger, and those which are further away are supposed to be very tiny, small, barely visible dots. So you can vary the distribution and the size a little bit so that it looks more natural. And in addition to the white, I can use some other colors. Maybe I can draw some yellowish flowers here and there to see if they will show up and if they will look nice. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that you couldn't really be able to do this on regular paper. On this textured paper covered with clear gesso, you can add these lighter details on top of the darker layers, and of course this is even easier on sandpaper if you're using like regular sandpaper. I normally like to use a 1000 grit sandpaper, or even if you're using artist quality sanded papers such as UArt and some others, that would be obviously even better. So those were the first three smaller drawings, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about drawing dirt and ground. So the way dirt looks when you look at it from up close, there's a lot of texture and there's a lot of smaller shapes. But normally we wouldn't be drawing it like that unless it were a closer view of a mound of, or a pile of dirt. But let's see what it will look like first, because I want to show you my approach to drawing this type of object, because it's a little bit different from drawing rocks, which I talked about in one of my previous tutorials. So the dominant color here will obviously be brown, although you can use other colors as well. But I'm going to use a brown as my base color. So first I drew the overall shape of that mound, and then I'm just going to cover it with a little bit of this walnut brown, and then we're going to work on some shading and texturing and defining some smaller details. So let's see how it goes. Now what you'll notice here is that this texture, the texture of the paper, the surface of the paper is producing a very nice texture that already looks like ground, which is working to my advantage. That's one of the things I like about this textured surface. The rough surface produces a very nice texture that you can use, and if you don't like it, you can soften it with blending tools, but here I intend to use it. Now, of course, with these objects, like any other object, you have to pay attention to the light source. My light source here is going to come from the left, and that's why I'm going to shade the right side of this mound a little bit more, and I'm going to make it darker with a dark sepia and a black colored pencil. But notice that I'm not covering everything. I am deliberately leaving some lighter patches here and there because I want to make it look like there are some lumps or pieces of that dirt which are a little bit lighter, while others are in the shadow, or maybe they're casting a shadow onto other parts of the mound. Now on top of that you can add some lighter marks to indicate some lighter areas which are facing towards the light source, but another way is to just leave those lighter spaces or do a little bit of erasing, because I have a lighter background anyway. So you can use that texture. You don't have to draw every single detail, but if you want to refine some of the details a little bit with some of your lighter pencils, you can do that to create more of a three-dimensional look. Now if you're wondering what is the difference between this pile of dirt and a group of rocks, for example, that I drew in one of my previous tutorials, well, the texture is different. Here the texture is a little bit finer, and you don't have as many of those jagged edges, and you don't have as much of a range of value in these. So it's a little bit different. Now we're going to move on to this final part of the tutorial where I'm going to draw a bit of grass and a dirt path, and it's going to be a winding path here in the middle with grass on both sides. And why am I doing that? This will be quite a bit different from this pile of dirt that I drew, because I want to show you that in most cases in landscapes you're not going to be drawing ground or dirt with so much detail. Maybe sometimes you'll have a close-up, but more often than not you'll just be drawing some fields and roads and things like that where you won't be able to see such tiny detail. So here you will mostly have to focus on the colors and maybe some textures and suggestions of some details, trying to create an illusion of detail. Now I want to show you another thing. So if you pay attention to this jagged shape of the road, it's because of the foreshortening. Normally when you look at it from above it looks straighter and smoother, the curve does, but when you look at it from this perspective it becomes shorter, it becomes more foreshortened, and the edge also gets much more jagged because of the way the path is winding, but also because of the smaller tufts of grass which are kind of growing into the side of the road. So I'm just going to cover the sides here with a little bit of darker green color to achieve a base color for my grass, and then I'm going to use the same approach that I did with some of these previous ones to draw a little bit of grass. I'm just going to blend that a little bit, and here and there modify the shape of this winding path, and then we're going to focus on drawing the grass. So once again, you want to pay attention to the point of view and how it influences the shape of the objects that you're drawing. So the part of the path which is closest to us is going to be getting wider and wider, and as we look further in the distance the path is going to be getting narrower and shorter. So now I'm adding some more of these darker marks to imitate the texture of the grass, starting with larger and taller marks which are closer to us, closer to our viewpoint, and then making them smaller and smaller as we go further back. So these are getting shorter and shorter, shorter and shorter, and then at one point it's almost like you don't even have to draw these vertical marks. You can just drag your pencil a little bit to produce a little bit of random texture. Maybe some indications of some shadow areas in between the tufts of grass, maybe some dips in the ground, who knows, doesn't really matter. You can add a few more of these marks, vertical marks here and there. You want to vary their direction a little bit to make the grass look less uniform. And then of course on top of that I'm going to add some lighter colors. Now let's see what I can do with this path. Here I'm going to use some slightly warmer colors, maybe a little bit of raw umber. And this is a nice color, but I still feel like this path should maybe be a little bit lighter. So I blended that a little bit, and I want to add some texture to it, like maybe there are some tracks here in this road, and maybe there's also a little bit more shadow on the sides of the road around that grass on the sides, because the grass, which is raised above the level of the path, will be casting a little bit of shadow onto the path. So these lines, these are just some indications of some tracks in that road. And I don't want to make the road look muddy. I want to make it look like a, how should I put it? I want to make it look like a dry dirt road in late summer or something like that. So I'm going to make it lighter, and I'm going to add these lighter marks on top, mostly using an ivory colored pencil, which is almost like slightly yellowish white colored pencil, a little bit darker than white. So I wanted to make this path a bit lighter. And maybe I made it too light, but that's okay, I can just easily modify it a bit later. And also in the middle of the road I'm going to add a few tufts of grass here and there, just to make it look like some parts of that path are not that well trodden, and like there's still a little bit of grass growing here and there. And of course these tufts of grass which are closer to our viewpoint are going to be larger, and then they're going to be getting smaller and smaller, and then barely visible as you look further away down that road. Just want to keep it random in terms of the distribution of the grass, and I want to have a little bit of that grass growing into the sides of the road, so that the shape of the road is really irregular. You don't want to make it look too smooth or too straight. I also added a few darker areas with a black colored pencil just to create a little bit more depth. And then of course on top of that I started adding these lighter marks with a light green pencil. I don't know, this is probably a grass green, or I don't know what it's called in the Faber-Castell range. But like I said, you can pick slightly different colors. These were just some colors that I had lying around, so I decided to use these because I had a dark one, a medium one, and a lighter one, so I thought that it would work. Maybe the colors ended up being a little bit cooler than I initially wanted, but also my camera doesn't really show the real colors that I see in real life, so the colors may be a little bit different. But I think you get the point. So I'm just going to modify the texture of this road a little bit, and then I'm going to start working on the grass on the other side of the road, on the right. Again, using the same approach, adding the darker marks with a dark green pencil to draw these darker blades of grass and darker tufts of grass, and to indicate some shadow areas between them, and of course again making the ones which are closer to us a little bit longer and taller, and the ones which are further away smaller and smaller, and then just dragging my pencil to create a little bit of texture that is supposed to remind the viewer of the texture of the grass as seen from a distance. I made the path a bit darker and added those lines for the tracks a bit, because I thought that I made it a bit too light, but now I'm back to refining the appearance of the grass on the right side. So adding those shadow areas with a black colored pencil just to make that dark enough before I move in with a light green pencil. And again, you can see that these lighter marks are showing up, and you want to vary their direction but their size as well. You want to pull your strokes in one way or the other, and you want to make some of them considerably longer than the others. That's because you want to make the grass look as natural as possible. You don't want to make it look uniform. I've already explained this a number of times, but variation is good when you're drawing landscape. So over there at the bottom I just dragged my pencil a little bit to add those greenish tones, lighter greenish tones, and then added some ochre on top of that just to have a little bit of variation in terms of color and value. And I think this is it. The tutorial is now done. This is just about everything that I wanted to show you. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. finally, I have to stress one more time that this surface that I'm working on is probably the most important thing here, because without it you can't really layer lighter colors on top of the darker ones. So if you worked on regular paper, this would be quite a bit more difficult to achieve. Anyway, if you like this video, don't forget to give me a like and subscribe, and check out my other videos. And if you want to see more content and longer videos, real-time footage and things like that, you should check out my Patreon. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye.